The fear of humans. Zara held her child close, her heart pounding like a wild drum. The shadows of the dark forest wrapped around them, hiding them from the world. Her son, Lirak, whimpered softly, his small hands gripping her arm. His pale blue skin was covered in dirt, and his breathing was weak. Zara knew they were not safe. They had crashed on this terrifying planet, Earth, a planet full of dangerous creatures called humans. She had heard the stories. Humans were monsters, ruthless, cold, destroyers of worlds. Back on her home planet, the elders spoke of human warships, of planets burned to nothing, of people who vanished without a trace. Humans did not show mercy. They did not feel pity. If they found her and Lirak, they would kill them both. Zara's heart ached. She had not meant to come here. She was only trying to escape. Her ship had been attacked by enemy hunters. In the chaos, she had lost control, and now she was here, stranded on a hostile world. And now, Lirak was hurt. The crash had injured his leg. He needed medicine. He needed safety, but Zara had neither. She pressed her forehead against his, a silent promise that she would keep him safe, no matter what. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Loud, heavy, getting closer. Zara's breath caught in her throat. A human was near. She pressed Lirak against her chest and shrank deeper into the shadows. Her body trembled, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she couldn't. If she moved, she would make noise. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a light flickered through the trees, a small round light that moved slowly, scanning the ground. Zara held her breath. Through the thick leaves, she saw him, a human male. He was tall, his body covered in strange, bulky armor. His face was hidden behind a dark helmet with a glass visor. In his hands, he held something long and metallic, a weapon. Zara's blood turned cold. This was it. He was going to find them. He was going to kill them. Lirak stirred weakly. A soft whimper escaped his lips. Zara's heart nearly stopped. The human turned sharply toward their hiding spot. He took a step forward, then another. His boots crunched against the fallen leaves. Zara gritted her teeth. She was not going to die like this. If this human attacked, she would fight. She was weak, exhausted and unarmed, but she would not let him take Lirak. The human stopped just a few feet away. He raised one hand, the one not holding the weapon. Then, to Zara's shock, he knelt down. His movements were slow, careful. His hand remained open, palm facing upward. It was a gesture she recognized, a sign of peace. Zara narrowed her eyes. Was this a trick? A game? Was he trying to make her lower her guard? The human spoke. His voice was deep but calm. "I know you're there," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." Zara stiffened. She did not understand all the words, but his tone, it was not cruel, not like the humans she had imagined. She stayed silent, watching him carefully. The human sighed, then did something unexpected. He set his weapon down on the ground. Zara's eyes widened. Why would he do that? If he was a killer, if he was hunting them, why would he lower his weapon? The human slowly reached into a pouch on his belt. For a moment, Zara thought he was pulling out another weapon, but instead, he held up a small metal container. He pressed a button, and the top clicked open. A strong smell filled the air. Food. The human placed it on the ground and slid it forward, closer to Zara's hiding place. Then he spoke again. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to be afraid." Zara's hands tightened around Lirak. This made no sense. Humans were monsters. They did not offer food. They did not show kindness. And yet this one was not attacking. He was not forcing her to come out. He was just waiting. Zara's mind raced. Could she trust him? Lirak let out another weak breath, his body growing limp. Zara felt panic rise in her chest. Her son was dying. He needed help. and this human was offering it. She had no choice. With a deep, shaky breath, Zara slowly stepped out from the shadows. The human did not move. He simply watched her, his visor reflecting the soft moonlight. Zara knelt down, keeping her arms tight around Lirak. She hesitated, then reached for the food. Their fingers nearly touched. For the first time in her life, she made contact with a human. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Maybe everything she had been told was a lie. Maybe humans were not monsters after all. The monster's kindness. Zara's hands trembled as she clutched the small food packet. She had not tasted human food before. She had heard rumors that it was poisoned, designed to weaken alien bodies. But she had no choice. Her son, Lirak, was dying. She looked down at him, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His blue skin, once full of life, had turned a sickly pale shade. His body was too weak to fight anymore. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. With a deep breath, she tore open the packet and sniffed. The scent was strong, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. It reminded her of the fields back home, where the wind carried the aroma of warm grains and fresh harvests. Her stomach twisted. Home. She would never see it again. Her hands tightened around the food. There was no time to think about the past. She had to act now. Slowly, carefully, she lifted a piece of the food to Lirak's lips. He was too weak to chew, so she pressed it gently inside his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his lips twitched, and his throat moved as he swallowed. Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The human, still kneeling a few feet away, watched silently. His large form was still, unmoving, but his head tilted slightly, as if studying them. His armor gleamed under the moonlight, and Zara could see her own frightened reflection in his dark visor. Why was he helping them? Every story she had heard about humans said they were ruthless, cruel, conquerors of worlds. Yet here he was, sitting on the damp ground, offering aid instead of harm. It didn't make sense. Lirak whimpered again, his small hand twitching against Zara's arm. His eyes flickered open for just a moment, filled with pain and confusion. Zara's heart ached. He wouldn't last much longer. She turned her gaze back to the human, narrowing her eyes. If he truly wanted to help, he would do more than offer food. Carefully, she shifted Lirak in her arms and pointed to his leg. It was wrapped in makeshift bandages, pieces of her own clothing, torn to stop the bleeding. But it wasn't enough. The human followed her gaze, and after a brief moment, he nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He removed his helmet. Zara tensed, ready for a monster's face. Instead, she saw something familiar. Beneath the helmet was a man, not a beast, not a creature of nightmares. His face was rough with stubble, his dark brown eyes filled with something strange, something she never expected from a human. Compassion. Zara froze. She had never seen a human's true face before. The old stories always described them as hideous, their eyes filled with fire, their mouths twisted in cruel snarls. But this one, he looked tired, worn, scared, and gentle. The man reached into his belt and pulled out a small metal case. He opened it, revealing strange tools and bottles filled with liquid. Zara's body tensed. Was this another trick? But then he took a small piece of cloth, poured something from a bottle onto it, and pressed it against his own arm. Zara's breath caught as she saw the liquid bubble slightly, then cool. He wasn't testing poison. He was showing her that it was safe. Slowly, he turned back to Lirak and gestured toward the wound. Zara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to protect her child, to never trust a human. But Lirak let out another weak pain sound. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she nodded. The human moved carefully, his hand steady. He unwrapped the crude bandages and examined the wound. His face remained calm, But Zara saw the small furrow in his brow. He was concerned. Zara clenched her fists. Was it that bad? Would Lirac survive? The human reached into his kit and pulled out a thin metal instrument. A needle. Zara's body went rigid. Poison. It had to be poison. Her instincts took over, and before she knew it, her claws were out, her sharp nails just inches from his throat. The human did not flinch. Instead, he slowly, very slowly, turned his hand to show her the bottle in his grip. There were strange markings on it, but one symbol caught her eye. It was universal, a medical sign. The realization hit her. It was not poison. It was medicine. Zara's breath came in short gasps. She had almost attacked the only person trying to help them. For a long moment, she did not move. Neither did the human. Finally, she forced herself to relax and gave a single nod. The human carefully injected the medicine into Lirac's leg. The child whimpered but did not wake. Zara watched closely, every muscle in her body tense. Would it work? Would it hurt him? Minutes passed. Then, Lirac's breathing became stronger. Zara's heart pounded. It was working. She turned to the human, still unable to understand why he was doing this. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The human met her gaze. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he simply said, "Because no mother should have to watch her child die." Zara's chest tightened. This human, this so-called monster, had just saved her son. Everything she had been taught, every warning, every story, every lesson about humans, had been a lie. But before she could process the truth, a sharp sound shattered the silence. Voices. More humans were coming. And they did not sound friendly. Zara's newfound trust was about to be tested. A risky decision. The air grew thick with tension. The distant voices of approaching humans sent a sharp chill down Zara's spine. She stiffened, instinct kicking in. Run. Hide. Fight, if necessary. But she didn't know if her body had the strength to fight. Her child, Lirac, had stopped whimpering. His breathing was stronger now, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The human's medicine had worked. He had saved Lirac's life. And now, he was the only thing standing between her and the real danger. Zara's eyes darted to the human kneeling before her. He had been cautious, careful, never making sudden moves to frighten her. His brown eyes, no longer hidden behind the helmet, were sharp but calm. He had not betrayed her. Yet. Would he? The voices drew closer, more footsteps. Heavy, armed. These were not simple travelers or explorers. They were hunters, soldiers. Zara's claws twitched. She would not go down without a fight. The human, this strange, gentle warrior, seemed to sense her fear. His gaze flickered between her and the dark forest behind them. Then, to her shock, he stood and stepped in front of her. He was shielding her. Zara's breath hitched. What was he doing? Why was he protecting them? Before she could ask, a sharp beam of light cut through the trees. "Captain Jake, we've been tracking movement in this sector. What did you find?" Zara flinched. The voice was rough, demanding, but it was not directed at her. It was calling to the human. Jake. The name sounded foreign to her ears. It belonged to a species she was raised to fear, but at this moment, it felt like a shield between her and the true danger. Jake turned slightly, keeping one hand raised toward the approaching figures. His other hand subtly moved behind his back, a silent signal to Zara. "Stay down. Stay hidden." Zara obeyed, lowering herself into the shadows with Lirac pressed against her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the night. But she couldn't, not without knowing what Jake would do. Just a false alarm. Jake called back. His voice was steady, controlled. Nothing dangerous here. The beam of light swayed, scanning the forest floor. "That's so." Another voice, This one colder, skeptical. We detected movement. We saw an impact zone. That ship didn't crash by itself. What are you hiding? Zara's muscles tensed. They knew. She glanced at Jake. Would he give them up? Would he turn her and Lirak over? His next words nearly made her heart stop. I found the wreckage, Jake admitted. A small pod, nothing more. No life forms inside. Probably just debris from an old battle. Zara's breath hitched. He was lying. Why? Why would a human lie for her? The soldiers weren't convinced. The first one stepped closer, his weapon slung lazily over his shoulder, but his stance was aggressive. You sure about that, Captain? The soldier asked. You wouldn't be hiding something, would you? Jake chuckled, but it was forced. What would I be hiding? Zara held her breath. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the faint crackling of distant radios. Then the soldier clicked his tongue. HQ wants a full sweep. Orders from above. We stay here and check every inch of this sector. If there's something here, we find it. Zara's heart pounded. They were going to search the area. If they looked closely, they would find her. Find Lirak. She clenched her jaw. If it came to it, she would fight. Even if it meant dying, she would not let them take her child. But before she could act, Jake shifted slightly. His voice was casual, almost bored. You really think that's worth the effort? The soldier frowned. Orders are orders. Yeah, sure, Jake said. But think about it. This place is a dead zone. There's nothing here but trees, dirt, and old crash sites. If you want to waste your night looking for ghosts, be my guest. The soldier hesitated. Zara saw it. The moment of doubt. Jake kept going, pressing his advantage. Or we could report back that we found nothing and call it a night. No wild chases, no paperwork, just an easy shift, and back to base. The other soldier groaned. Man's got a point. The first soldier scowled. HQ will ask questions, and we'll say we answered them. Jake countered smoothly. Unless, of course, you want to tell command we spent the night chasing shadows. The soldier muttered a curse under his breath. Then, after a long moment, he sighed. Fine. Pack it up. Zara felt the air shift. They were leaving. Jake had done it. One by one, the soldiers turned, their boots crunching against the dirt as they moved away. Their lights faded into the distance. Zara remained frozen, her arms still locked protectively around Lirak. Was this another trick? Then, Jake turned toward her, his expression unreadable. He crouched down, keeping his voice low. They'll be back, he warned. And next time, they won't be so easy to convince. Zara swallowed hard. Why? Why did you help us? Jake exhaled, running a hand through his short, dark hair. Because I don't believe in killing people who are just trying to survive. Zara's chest tightened. This human was unlike any she had imagined. For the first time in her life, she questioned everything she had been taught. Humans were monsters, weren't they? Jake stood, offering a hand. You have two choices, he said. Stay here and hope they don't come back. Or come with me, and I'll find you a safe place. Zara stared at the offered hand. Could she really trust him? She looked down at Lirak, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since the crash. She already knew the answer. With a deep breath, she reached out and grasped the human's hand. The chase. The night was no longer silent. A sharp mechanical whirring cut through the stillness of the forest, sending a cold shiver down Zora's spine. It was a sound she recognized instantly. A hunter drone. Not human. Far worse. Zara's heart pounded as she turned toward the sky. A dark metallic figure hovered above the treetops, its red sensors scanning the ground with deadly precision. The drone let out a piercing electronic beep, then shifted direction. Toward them. They had been found. Jake cursed under his breath, his muscles tensing. Damn it. Move. Zara didn't need to be told twice. She clutched Lirak tightly against her chest and bolted into the trees, her body running on pure instinct. Survival. Protect. Escape. The drone let out a sharp mechanical click, then the air behind them exploded. Zara flinched as a blast of fire and metal ripped through the spot where they had just been standing. Bark and dirt rained down around them. The force of the explosion nearly knocked her off her feet, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward. No time to think. No time to panic. Run. Jake was beside her, his long strides covering the ground with ease. His human armor was heavy, but he moved fast, guiding her through the trees like he knew this land by heart. "The ridge," he shouted, pointing ahead. "If we make it, we can lose it in the valley." Zara barely understood his words, but she didn't need to. The urgency in his voice was enough. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exhaustion. Lirak's weight in her arms was heavy, but she would not let go. Another mechanical beep. Another explosion. Zara felt the heat at her back as the ground shook beneath her feet. The drone wasn't missing by accident. It was hurting them. Her mind raced. The enemy hunters must have sent the drone. They were the ones who had attacked her ship, forcing her to crash here. And now, they were finishing what they started. Her species, the Valorians, were peaceful, but their enemies, the Sindraki, were not. The Sindraki took what they wanted, destroyed what they couldn't, and they never left survivors. She stole a quick glance at Jake. Did he understand what they were up against? Did he even know what the Sindraki were? It didn't matter. Right now, he was running to protect her, to protect Lirak. And that was all that mattered. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing a steep ridge. Below it, a twisting valley of rocks and shadows stretched far and wide. They were running out of ground. Jake skidded to a stop, scanning the drop. Zara's breath came fast and shallow as she turned, her claws digging into the dirt. The drone hovered just beyond the treetops, its sensor locking onto them. A mechanical voice echoed through the air, speaking in Sindraki dialect. "Target acquired. Prepare for termination." Zara's stomach turned to ice. Jake lifted his weapon, but before he could fire, the drone's guns began to charge. In a split second, Zara made her choice. With every ounce of strength left in her body, she turned and jumped. The fall. The world spun. Wind howled past her ears. She kept Lirak close, shielding him with her own body as they tumbled down the ridge. She heard Jake shout something, but the rush of air drowned out his voice. Then, impact. Zara hit the ground hard, rolling across the rocky terrain. Pain shot through her side, but she ignored it. Lirak whimpered in her arms, his tiny fingers clutching her clothing. She had no time to check for injuries. Above them, the drone let out an angry beep and began to descend into the valley. Zara's breath hitched. It wasn't giving up. It was following them. Then, a second impact. Jake had jumped too. He landed just feet away, rolling with practiced ease before springing back up. His armor took most of the damage, but he still grunted in pain. Zara couldn't believe it. He had followed her. He hadn't left them behind. There was no time to process it. The drone had locked onto them again. Jake grabbed Zora's wrist and pulled her up. "Run." Zora didn't argue. She ran. The valley was narrow, winding between sharp rocks and towering cliffs. The drone's flight was limited here. It couldn't move as freely, and its weapons had a harder time locking onto them. Jake took advantage of this, leading them into a small cave hidden between two massive stones. They collapsed inside, breathless, pressed against the cool rock. The drone hovered outside, scanning the entrance. The red light flickered, as if uncertain. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, it moved on. Silence. For the first time in what felt like eternity, the forest was quiet again. A moment to breathe. Zara's chest rose and fell rapidly. Every muscle in her body ached. Lirak, still in her arms, let out a weak cough but did not stir. He was safe. She turned toward Jake, who was sitting with his back against the cave wall, his own breathing ragged. His face was covered in sweat, but his expression was unreadable. They had survived. For now. Zara swallowed hard. She had been running for so long. Running from Sindraki. Running from humans. Running from everything she had ever feared. But tonight, she had run beside a human. And he had saved her. Twice. She hesitated, then finally whispered, "Why?" Jake looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. "Why what?" he asked, voice rough. Zara's fingers curled into Lirak's clothing. Why did he fight for them? Why did he protect them? Why had he jumped after them instead of saving himself? Instead, she asked, "Why didn't you leave?" Jake exhaled, staring at the cave ceiling for a long moment. Then, in a quiet, tired voice, he said, "Because that's not what a good man does." Zara stared at him. She had spent her whole life believing humans were monsters. But this human, this one human, had risked everything for her and her child. Maybe she had been wrong. Before she could say anything, a new sound echoed through the valley. A radio transmission. A human voice. "This is Alpha Command. Captain Jake, report. The scanners picked up enemy activity near your location. What's your status?" Zara's blood ran cold. Jake's team was still looking for them. Would he turn her in now? Had she trusted too soon? Jake sighed and reached for his radio. Zara held her breath. Then, Jake pressed the radio's power button, turning it off. Zara's eyes widened. He had just cut himself off from his own people. Jake glanced at her and gave a tired smirk. "Guess I'm a traitor now. Hunted like prey." The silence inside the cave was suffocating. The only sound was the distant hum of the drone, its sensors scanning the valley like a mechanical predator searching for its next kill. Zara sat frozen, clutching Lirak to her chest. The child's breathing had stabilized, but he was still weak, his body exhausted from the crash, the wounds, and the endless running. She traced her fingers lightly over his forehead, silently thanking whatever force in the universe had kept him alive this long. Then she turned to the human, Jake, the man who had risked everything for them. He was leaning against the cave wall, his breathing uneven. His hands were still resting on his knees, and his head was tilted slightly back, as if he were processing what had just happened. The moment replayed in Zara's mind, the way he had turned off his own radio. That single action had changed everything. She had been sure he would turn her in. It would have been the logical thing to do. Humans were supposed to hate her kind. And yet, Jake had just cut himself off from his own people. Zara's throat was dry. "You didn't answer them." Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with one hand. "Yeah, well, guess I didn't feel like talking." Zara narrowed her eyes. "You defied them. You cut off your own team." Jake let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, thanks for the recap." He sighed and leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "I'm already questioning my life choices, don't worry." Zara studied him carefully. He didn't seem panicked. Annoyed, maybe. Frustrated, but not afraid. "Why?" She shifted slightly. "Won't they come looking for you?" Jake's jaw tightened. "They will." That was the part that made her nervous. She had been running for so long. From the Sindraki, from humans, from death itself. And now she had found a human who was running too. Jake looked at her then, his brown eyes scanning her face, as if searching for something. "You don't trust me." Zara hesitated. "I don't trust humans." Jake let out a short laugh. "That's fair." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then, without warning, Jake suddenly pushed himself to his feet. Zara's body tensed, preparing to defend herself. But then she realized he wasn't attacking. He was listening, his head tilted slightly, his gaze flickering toward the cave entrance. Zara's skin prickled. Something was out there. She tightened her grip on Lurak and listened. At first, all she could hear was the faint rustling of wind through the valley. But then, another sound. Soft, barely audible, but too rhythmic to be natural. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Jake cursed under his breath. They're here. Zara's heart pounded. His people. His soldiers. The ones who wouldn't listen to his lies this time. Jake turned to her, his expression hardening. We have to move. Zara's jaw clenched. Lurak is too weak to run again. Jake's gaze flickered to the child in her arms. He exhaled sharply, then ran a hand through his short, dark hair. Okay, he muttered, thinking. We do this another way. Zara's pulse quickened. What way? Jake did not answer. Instead, he moved toward the cave entrance and stepped outside. Zara's breath caught. What was he doing? She shifted closer, pressing herself against the rocky wall to see what was happening. Jake stood just a few feet from the entrance. His stance relaxed, but his right hand was hovering dangerously close to his weapon. A voice echoed through the valley. Captain Jake Carson. Zara's blood ran cold. The voice was deep, authoritative. It belonged to a man who was used to giving orders. Zara didn't recognize the human standing at the edge of the valley, but she knew his type. He was a commander, a leader, a predator. Behind him, 5 human soldiers stood in formation, their weapons at the ready. Jake didn't move. Lieutenant, he greeted casually, like they were old friends meeting for a drink. The lieutenant, a tall man with sharp gray eyes and a scar down his cheek, didn't return the pleasantries. Instead, his gaze swept the valley, scanning the rocks, the dirt, the entrance of the cave. Zara held her breath. He was looking for them. We picked up Sindraki activity in this area, the lieutenant said. We also track your radio, right up until you turned it off. Jake shrugged. Signal interference. You know how it is. The lieutenant's eyes didn't waver. You've been off mission for over an hour. Jake let out a slow breath. Yeah, got a little lost. The lieutenant's lips pressed into a thin line. Is that so? Zara could tell he didn't believe a word of it. The soldiers behind him shifted slightly, their fingers hovering near their weapons. They were ready to shoot. Jake tilted his head slightly, keeping his posture calm. Why don't you tell me what this is really about, Lieutenant? The commander's expression darkened. This is about loyalty, Captain. Zara's pulse spiked. They knew. Jake knew it too. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his stance shifted slightly. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. So that's how it is, huh? The lieutenant's eyes flickered toward the cave entrance. Zara's stomach dropped. He had seen something. A shadow. A glimpse of movement. His hand dropped toward his gun. And that was when Jake moved. Fast. Before the lieutenant could react, Jake grabbed his wrist, twisted, and ripped the gun from his hand. Then, chaos. The soldiers lunged forward, but Jake was already moving. He grabbed the lieutenant's shoulder, using him as a human shield. Hold your fire, the lieutenant shouted, but his men were hesitating. Zara saw her chance. She didn't think, she acted. With Lurak secured in her arms, she bolted from the cave and ran. Jake saw her move and reacted instantly. He released the lieutenant with a shove, then fired 2 shots into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dirt and dust. The soldiers coughed and staggered back. Run, Jake shouted. Zara ran. She heard the lieutenant cursing behind them, shouting orders. Then, gunfire. Jake caught up to her, shoving her forward as bullets sliced through the air. They had seconds, maybe less. And then, ahead of them, Zara saw a ship. A Sindraki warpod. It had landed in the valley, waiting, watching. A third threat. Zara's breath caught. They were trapped. The ultimate sacrifice. The valley was a war zone waiting to happen. On one side, human soldiers, armed and ready, their commander barking orders to surround the escapees. On the other, a Sindraki warpod, its engines humming as the sleek black metal ship cast an ominous shadow over the rocky terrain. And in the middle of it all, Jake, Zara, and Lirak. Zara's heart pounded as she tightened her grip on her son. His small body remained limp in her arms, his breathing steady but weak. He couldn't run anymore. She had to protect him. But how? They had nowhere left to go. Jake turned his head, assessing both threats in an instant. His face was tense, his sharp brown eyes darting between the humans he once called his team and the monstrous machine that had come to finish what had started. The lieutenant, standing at the front of the human soldiers, raised his hand. "Captain, stand down." His voice carried through the valley like a hammer, sharp and commanding. Jake's jaw clenched. He knew what that order meant. It meant surrender. It meant Zara and Lirak would be taken, interrogated, locked away, or worse. He exhaled, glancing at Zara. She knew what he was thinking. He wasn't going to let that happen. But before either of them could move, the Sindraki pod's doors hissed open. A figure stepped out. Zara froze. The being that emerged was tall, armored, and horrifyingly familiar. Sindraki Commander Vale. Her blood ran cold. This was the one who had ordered the attack on her ship. This was the one who had nearly killed Lirak. This was the monster she had spent her entire life fearing. Val's dark, reptilian eyes glowed beneath his helmet as he scanned the battlefield. He let out a low guttural laugh. Well, the little Valorian did survive. His voice slithered through the air like poison. Zara's grip on Lirak tightened. Her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to fight. Anything. But she had nowhere left to go. Val's gaze flickered toward Jake. His amusement deepened. And what's this? A human. Protecting a Valorian. How pathetic. Jake didn't react. He just kept his body between Zara and the approaching Sindraki. The lieutenant called out again. "Captain, step aside. This isn't your fight." Jake let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You're right," he muttered. "It's not." Then, in a single explosive motion, he raised his weapon and shot the Sindraki commander in the chest. The blast sent Vale staggering back. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the Sindraki opened fire. Zara dived behind a rock, shielding Lirak as gunfire erupted from both sides. The human soldiers, startled by Jake's attack, reacted on instinct. They returned fire, their bullets cutting through the valley in a storm of metal and energy blasts. The battle had begun. The fight for survival. Jake moved like a man who had nothing left to lose. His boots skidded against the dirt as he fired round after round, ducking behind rocks for cover before unleashing precise, deadly shots. The human soldiers, confused by their former captain's betrayal, hesitated, but the Sindraki did not. Their return fire was relentless. Energy beams scorched the ground, blasting holes into the earth. Zara clutched Lirak tightly, pressing her back against the rock, her pulse thundering in her ears. They had to escape. She turned to Jake, but before she could call to him, she saw it. A Sindraki warrior had flanked him, moving fast, weapon raised. Jake spun, but too late. A sharp electrified blade sliced through the air and plunged into Jake's side. Zara's breath stopped. Jake's body jerked as the energy blade burned through his armor, tearing into flesh. But instead of falling, instead of screaming, he moved. With a snarl, Jake grabbed the Sindraki by the wrist, twisted, and broke it. The alien let out a shriek of pain, but Jake wasn't done. He ripped the blade from his own body and drove it straight through his enemy's chest. The Sindraki collapsed. Jake stumbled. Zara felt a sharp, horrible twist in her chest. He was injured, badly. Blood soaked through his armor, dripping onto the dirt below. His breathing was uneven, his hands shaking. And yet he didn't stop fighting. He turned, lifting his gun, ready to protect them even as he bled out. Zara couldn't take it. She had to do something. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a killer. But she was a mother. And she wasn't going to lose another life. Clenching her jaw, she reached into the small pouch at her waist. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a small metallic sphere. A Valorian shock bomb. She only had one. One chance. Zara's pulse pounded as she activated the device. A faint blue glow flickered to life in the center of the sphere, pulsing like a heartbeat. She looked at Jake. He was barely standing now, but he still had his gun raised, still willing to fight to the last breath. No, she wouldn't let him die here. With a sharp inhale, she threw the bomb. The small sphere sailed through the air, landing right in the middle of the battlefield. For half a second, nothing happened. Then, a massive pulse of blue light erupted outward. The Sindreki soldiers collapsed instantly, their bodies seizing up as the electric shockwave immobilized them. The humans staggered, some falling, but their armor protected them from the worst of it. Jake barely remained upright, swaying, his breathing ragged. The Sindreki war pod, now without its ground troops, began to retreat. The battle was over. But Jake was falling. A life for a life. Zara caught him before he hit the ground. His body was heavy, covered in blood and sweat. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. Zara's chest tightened. He had saved them. Again. And now, he was dying. No. She reached into her pouch again, her fingers grasping the one thing she had left. A Valorian healing serum. It wasn't designed for humans. It could be dangerous. It could kill them. But he was already dying. She had no choice. With shaking hands, she injected the serum into his wound. Jake let out a sharp gasp. His entire body shuddered. Zara held her breath. Would it work? Would he survive? Or had she just killed the only human who had ever protected her? A new hope. Zara's hands trembled as she held onto Jake's unconscious body, his blood still warm against her skin. The serum was already coursing through his veins, his body convulsing violently as it fought against the foreign medicine. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. What if it didn't work? What if it was too much for a human body to handle? She pressed a shaking hand against his chest, feeling the weak rise and fall beneath his armor. His breathing was ragged, uneven, but still there. Please, she thought desperately, looking down at him. You can't die now. Not after everything. Lyrek stirred in her arms, his small fingers twitching slightly. He was alive because of this human. He was safe because of Jake's sacrifice. And if Jake died now, Zara would never forgive herself. The battlefield around them had gone eerily silent. The Sindreki war pod had retreated, its pilots realizing their ground forces had been neutralized. The human soldiers, still recovering from the shock bomb, were scattered across the valley, stunned but alive. She knew it wouldn't take them long to recover. And once they did, they would come for her and Lyrek. Zara clenched her jaw. She couldn't let that happen. The first breath of a new beginning. Jake's body stopped convulsing. For a terrifying moment, he was completely still. Zara's heart clenched. No, 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 she whispered, pressing her fingers against his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. Then, a sharp inhale. Jake's entire body arched upward, his muscles tensing as he sucked in a deep, shuddering breath. His fingers clenched into fists, his chest heaved. His eyes flew open. For a moment, they were wild, confused, unfocused. His body trembled as he tried to move, but the pain made him groan, his hand instinctively pressing against his side where the wound had been. He blinked up at her, his breath still labored. "Damn," he rasped, his voice hoarse. That was not fun. Zara let out a choked sound, half a laugh, half a sob. He was alive. The serum had worked. She had saved him. "You idiot," she whispered. shaking her head as relief flooded her system. You were dying. Jake managed a weak smirk. And now I'm not. Zora exhaled sharply. Not yet, at least. Jake winced as he tried to sit up, his hand moving to his side. The wound was healing rapidly, the serum already repairing the damage. It wasn't perfect. He still looked exhausted, still pale from blood loss. But he wasn't dying anymore. Zora swallowed hard. How do you feel? Jake gave a slow, shaky nod. Like I got stabbed by an alien and brought back to life by another one. Zora smirked. Accurate. Then, reality slammed back into place. The human soldiers were stirring, their confusion turning into realization. Their weapons were still nearby. Zora knew what would happen next. If they saw Jake alive, if they realized he had been healed by alien technology, they would take him. They would take her. They would take Lirak. And she wouldn't let that happen. She turned to Jake. We have to go. Jake followed her gaze, understanding flickering in his eyes. He cursed under his breath. Yeah, you're right. A traitor and a fugitive. Jake pushed himself up with a grunt, his strength still returning. Zora steadied him instinctively, his weight pressing against her for just a moment before he found his balance. His eyes flickered to Lirak, who was still sleeping soundly despite the chaos. His expression softened for just a moment before hardening again. He turned toward the soldiers. The lieutenant, the same man who had been hunting them, was groaning as he sat up, blinking rapidly. Jake clenched his jaw. They're going to be after us, aren't they? Zora nodded. Once they understand what happened, yes. Jake exhaled. Then we don't give them the chance. Zora's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? Jake turned to her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he smirked. I know where we can go. Zora hesitated. You're serious? Jake gave her a pointed look. Zora, I just turned my back on my own people, got stabbed, died for like 5 seconds, and woke up with alien magic. Yeah, I'm serious. Zora studied him for a long moment. Then, despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty, she smiled. All right, she said. Lead the way, human. The final escape. The human soldiers were recovering quickly. If they hesitated any longer, they wouldn't get another chance. Jake grabbed a fallen weapon from one of the unconscious soldiers and slung it over his back. Zora adjusted Lirak in her arms. Then together, they ran. The valley stretched before them. The distant mountains bathed in moonlight. Jake led the way, his steps steady despite the injury, despite everything he had been through. Zora followed, her heart pounding, her mind racing with the realization of what they had just done. They had defied everything. A human soldier had turned against his own kind. A Valorian mother had put her faith in the very species she had been raised to fear. And now, they were fugitives, together. Lirak stirred in her arms, his small voice whispering something in Valorian tongue. Zora glanced down at him, her heart tightening. Jake looked over at her. What did he say? Zora hesitated, then met Jake's gaze. He called you uncle. Jake blinked, stunned for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he grinned. Well, he said, adjusting the weapon on his back. Guess I better live up to the title. Zora laughed. A real, genuine laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. They disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind everything they had known. The hunter and the hunted. The soldier and the refugee. The human and the alien. Bound not by blood, not by duty, but by something far, far stronger.